On a crisp autumn morning outside the New York County Supreme Court, the cameras weren't just focused on the billionaire Conrad Beaumont, a man who could buy and sell entire city blocks before breakfast. They were focused on two women. One, a stunning young woman named Sloane Parker, stood waiting by a black Escalade, her face a perfect mask of anxious hope. She was the mistress, the future Mrs. Beaumont, waiting for her man to be free. The other, Genevieve Beaumont, the current wife, was already inside. Everyone expected her to walk out with a respectable pre-negotiated settlement. The tabloids had called it a done deal. But what happened in that courtroom wasn't a settlement. It was a slaughter. A story of a woman who was forgotten, underestimated, and ultimately a queen who took back her entire kingdom. The air outside the New York County Supreme Court on Center Street was electric, a toxic cocktail of media frenzy and raw high-stakes capitalism. It was less a legal proceeding and more a public coronation or perhaps an execution. At the center of the storm was Conrad Beaumont, the titan behind Beaumont Global. With a jawline as sharp as his business acumen and a fortune valued at a staggering $18 billion, Conrad was a modern-day king. His empire spanned from futuristic green energy projects in Nevada to gleaming skyscrapers that reshaped the London skyline, and like many kings, he had grown tired of his queen. Waiting on the periphery, a deliberate public statement of her position, was Sloane Parker. Dressed in a cream-colored Bottega Veneta suit that screamed quiet luxury. She was the picture of devoted support. At 28, she was 20 years younger than Genevieve, the woman inside. Sloane was a former VP in Conrad's acquisitions department, a shark in her own right, whose ambition was matched only by her beauty. She had played her cards perfectly, she believed. She had won the man. Now she was simply waiting for the formalities to conclude so she could claim the title that came with him. She checked her phone, ignoring the reporters shouting her name. Any minute now, Conrad would walk out, a free man, and their new life would begin. The prenuptial agreement she'd been assured was ironclad, a relic of a bygone era designed to protect the king from the very woman who had helped build his throne. Inside Courtroom 42 was a study in contrasts. The room was ornate with dark wood paneling and portraits of stern-faced judges from centuries past. It smelled of old paper and new money. Conrad Beaumont sat beside his lawyer, the notoriously ruthless Walter Finch. Finch was a legal predator, known for shredding witnesses on the stand and reducing complex human lives to bullet points on a settlement offer. Conrad himself looked bored, exuding an aura of invincibility. He occasionally glanced at his Patek Philippe watch, as if this whole affair was an inconvenient delay to a board meeting. He had offered Genevieve $250 million, $250 million. It was in his mind an act of profound generosity. More money than she could ever spend. An easy, clean break. Then there was Genevieve Beaumont. Seated beside her counsel, she was an island of stillness in the turbulent room. At 48, she didn't possess Sloane's youthful fire, but she had something far more potent, an unreadable, almost unnerving composure. Dressed in a simple, elegant navy blue dress, she looked not like a woman on the verge of losing her husband, but like a CEO about to close a deal. Her hair was pulled back, revealing features that were handsome rather than pretty, etched with the fine lines of a life lived with intensity and observation. For 25 years she had been the silent partner, the hostess, the strategist behind the scenes. The world saw her as Mrs. Beaumont, a socialite, an accessory. Conrad saw her as a part of his history he was ready to archive. They were both about to discover how catastrophically wrong they were. The proceedings had been shockingly brief. No long drawn-out testimony, no tearful accusations. Genevieve's lawyer, a sharp, unassuming woman named Veronica Diaz, had presented a single, meticulously organized binder of evidence. Walter Finch had scoffed at it initially. He'd seen it all before: credit card statements, photos of lavish parties, attempts to prove lifestyle. He assumed Diaz was posturing, trying to squeeze a few extra million for her client. "Your Honor," Finch had said, his voice dripping with condescension, "we have a prenuptial agreement, signed by both parties, with full legal counsel on May 12th, 1999. It clearly stipulates a one-time payment of $10 million adjusted for inflation, plus the deed to the Connecticut home. My client's offer of $250 million is over 10 times the legal requirement. It is more than fair. It is magnanimous." Judge Morrison, a woman who had presided over this court for 2 decades and had seen her share of billionaire hubris, peered over her glasses at Veronica Diaz. "Ms. Diaz is your client contesting the validity of this agreement." Diaz stood. She was not a courtroom performer. She spoke in a calm, factual tone that somehow carried more weight than Finch's theatrics. "No, Your Honor. We are not contesting the validity of the prenup. We are here to enforce it. Specifically, Clause 7-B. A ripple of confusion went through Conrad's side of the table. Clause 17B. He vaguely remembered it. Something boilerplate Finch had told him all those years ago. Something about intellectual contributions. It was meaningless. Clause 17B. Diaz continued, her voice cutting through the silence. The Intellectual Property and Seed Capital Addendum. It states that any and all business assets derived directly from intellectual property or foundational seed concepts provided by either party remain the shared property of the partnership, with equity assigned in proportion to the concept's contribution to the final enterprise's valuation. Finch started to laugh, a short barking sound. "Your Honor, this is absurd. Mrs. Beaumont was an art history major. The foundational concept of Beaumont Global was my client's genius. Period." Diaz didn't flinch. She simply opened the binder. "Your Honor, I am about to prove that the entire $18 billion valuation of Beaumont Global, from its flagship Helios Energy Project to its real estate division, was derived directly from a foundational seed concept that did not belong to Conrad Beaumont. It belonged to his wife." Conrad stopped looking at his watch. He turned, and for the first time that morning, truly looked at the woman he was divorcing. The serene, placid expression on Genevieve's face was gone. In its place was a look of cold, diamond-hard resolve. It was a look he hadn't seen in 25 years. And in that moment, the king felt the first terrifying tremor of his castle walls beginning to crack. The story of Conrad and Genevieve Beaumont didn't begin in a Park Avenue penthouse. It began in a cramped, drafty apartment near Columbia University in 1997. He was a brash MBA student with boundless ambition and a knack for convincing people he was a genius long before he'd had a single brilliant idea. She was a graduate student, not in art history, as Walter Finch had so dismissively claimed, but pursuing a dual master's in sustainable urban planning and economics. Genevieve was the quiet engine to his gleaming chassis. While Conrad was out networking charming investors with visions he hadn't yet figured out how to build, Genevieve was in their small apartment, surrounded by textbooks and blueprints fueled by cheap coffee. She was the one who built his financial models, who ghostwrote his business plans, who saw the future not as a vague landscape of profit, but as a complex, interconnected system. Conrad's ambition was a fire, but Genevieve provided the schematics for the furnace. She was fascinated by a then niche concept, the economic symbiosis between green energy generation and smart real estate development. Her thesis, a 300-page document titled The Helios Model, a closed-loop economic framework for sustainable urban growth, was her magnum opus. It wasn't just theory, it was a practical step-by-step blueprint for creating self-sustaining communities where commercial and residential properties were powered by their own localized renewable energy grids. The profits, she argued, would be exponential, as the company would own not just the buildings, but the very power that ran them. Conrad had been initially dismissive. "Too academic," he'd said, waving a hand. "People want returns, Jenna, not lectures on carbon footprints." But he was smart enough to recognize a powerful idea when he saw it, especially one he could claim as his own. He read her thesis. Then he read it again. He absorbed its language, its data, its revolutionary framework. Over the next few months, Genevieve's Helios model slowly, insidiously became our idea, and then finally, my vision. When Conrad secured his first round of seed funding, it was her thesis repackaged into a glossy pitch deck with his face on the cover that won over the venture capitalists. He was the charismatic front man. She was the ghostwriter of the revolution. She didn't mind, not then. She was in love, and she believed in their shared future. His success was her success. The day he proposed, he also presented her with the prenuptial agreement. It was 1999. He had just closed the deal for the land in the Nevada desert that would become the first Helios Project test site. "It's just a formality, honey," he'd said, sliding the thick document across their small kitchen table. "Finch says it's standard practice. Protects us both." Genevieve read through the dense legalese. She saw the standard clauses, the flat payout, the waiver of future claims on his income. It felt cold, transactional. It felt like he was already planning for the end before they had even begun. Her heart sank. But then she saw Clause 71B, the intellectual property and seed capital addendum. Her lawyer, a young woman just starting her own practice, had flagged it as unusual. "This clause is oddly specific," her lawyer had warned over the phone. "It's almost like a corporate IP clause, not something for a marriage contract. It's unenforceable without concrete proof of contribution, which is almost impossible to provide in a marriage." But Genevieve insisted it stay. When she discussed it with Conrad, he just laughed. "Finch just throws in everything but the kitchen sink. What intellectual property? Your brilliant recipe for pasta sauce." He was being charming, disarming. He thought it was a joke. Genevieve knew better. She looked him in the eye. "No, Conrad. It's for my ideas, for the Helios model." For a flicker of a second, his smile faltered. A flash of something annoyance, fear, crossed his face. But it was gone as quickly as it came. He leaned in and kissed her. "Of course, honey. Your ideas are the most valuable thing I have." He signed the agreement without another word, confident that the clause was a meaningless sentiment, a ghost in the legal machine that could never be substantiated. What he didn't know was that Genevieve, methodical and meticulous even then, had already taken a precaution. The day after he first pitched the Helios model to investors, she had taken her original, hand-annotated, coffee-stained thesis manuscript, placed it in a sealed envelope, and mailed it to herself via registered post. When it arrived, she didn't open it. She placed the sealed postmarked package, a perfect, legally recognized time capsule, from a date before their marriage, before his company even had a name, into a safe deposit box. It was a quiet act of self-preservation, a nagging instinct that one day the ghost in the machine might need to be brought to life. She was ensuring her legacy, even if she hoped she would never have to cash the policy. For 25 years that policy sat dormant, As Beaumont Global exploded into a multi-billion-dollar behemoth, the world celebrated the singular genius of Conrad Beaumont. He was on the cover of Forbes, Time and Wired. In every interview, he told the story of how he alone in his dorm room sketched out the revolutionary idea that would change the world. Genevieve the architect became the hostess. Her strategic mind, which once mapped out global energy grids, was now praised for mapping out seating charts at glittering charity galas. She became a beautiful, elegant footnote in the epic tale of her husband's success. And for years she allowed it. She loved him, and she loved the life they had built, even if her role in it had been deliberately erased from the official history. Until the day she discovered that history wasn't the only thing he was trying to erase. The discovery of the affair wasn't a dramatic confrontation. It was a quiet, sickening revelation delivered by the cold glow of an iPad screen. Genevieve was in the library of their Hamptons estate, Seacliff, a sprawling testament to their success. She was coordinating a fundraiser for the Met, cross-referencing donor lists, when a shared calendar notification popped up. It was from Conrad's executive assistant, a reminder for CB, SP, Four Seasons, Bosphorus, anniversary dinner. Genevieve frowned. SP. She didn't recognize the initials, and their anniversary wasn't for another 4 months. Curiosity, a long dormant instinct, pricked at her. With a few clicks, she navigated the labyrinthine servers of Beaumont Global, an intricate system she herself had helped design the architecture for in the early 2000s. She still had high-level administrative access, a detail Conrad had long forgotten, deeming it irrelevant. She searched the employee directory for SP Sloane Parker, Vice President, Mergers and Acquisitions, a stunning, fiercely intelligent woman Genevieve had met at a few company functions. Then she pulled up Conrad's travel expenses. The business trip to Istanbul last month. The hotel folio from the Four Seasons Bosphorus. A dinner reservation for 2 at a private table. Flowers, champagne. The date of the reservation coincided with the 1-year anniversary of the day Sloane Parker had closed her first major deal for the company. He wasn't just cheating. He was celebrating a new life, a new partnership with her replacement. There was no screaming, no throwing of priceless vases. A profound, icy calm washed over Genevieve. The grief was there, a deep, tectonic ache, but it was overshadowed by a sudden, jarring clarity. It wasn't just about the infidelity. It was about the erasure. For years he had been slowly, methodically, writing her out of their shared story. He had taken her ideas, her strategies, her life's work, and repackaged it as his own solitary triumph. Now he was preparing to replace her physical presence with a younger, shinier model, discarding her like an outdated piece of technology. She looked around the library at the shelves filled with leather-bound first editions, the Rothko painting on the wall, the view of the Atlantic Ocean. This wasn't just a home. It was a cage, albeit a beautifully gilded one. And she had helped build it, bar by golden bar. That night she didn't confront him. When he came home complaining about traffic on the Long Island Expressway, she listened patiently. She asked about his day. She played the part of the devoted wife perfectly. But inside a switch had been flipped. The loving partner was gone, and in her place, the strategist had reawakened. For the next 18 months, Genevieve operated in the shadows. She became a ghost in her own life, observing, collecting, and planning. She used her server access to quietly download 2 decades' worth of emails, board meeting minutes, and internal memos. She found the early-stage pitch decks. Conrad had used the ones that plagiarized entire paragraphs from her thesis. She tracked the flow of money, the creation of shell corporations, the way Conrad had systematically leveraged the core Helios concept to expand into every other facet of their empire. Every new building, every acquisition, every stock split, she could trace its lineage directly back to the blueprint she had created in that tiny apartment all those years ago. She hired Veronica Diaz, not from a flashy Manhattan firm, but from a smaller boutique practice known for its ferocious forensic accounting and its focus on complex intellectual property law. Diaz wasn't a celebrity lawyer. She was a giant killer. Their first meeting took place not in an office, but on a bench in Central Park. "He's offering me $250 million to go away quietly," Genevieve said, her voice devoid of emotion. Diaz watched a horse-drawn carriage trot by. "And you don't want it?" It wasn't a question. "That money is an insult," Genevieve replied. "It's a tip. It's what a king gives a retiring servant. He thinks he's buying my silence, my complicity in the lie he's built. I'm not interested in a payout. I want what's mine by right. I want the company." Diaz raised an eyebrow. "The entire company, Genevieve. You signed a prenup. They will paint you as a bitter, greedy trophy wife." "Let them try," Genevieve said. She then handed Diaz a key to a safe deposit box. "Before you decide whether to take my case, I want you to look at something. It's been waiting for 25 years. 2 days later, Diaz called her. The younger lawyer's voice was filled with an awe she rarely displayed. "My God, Genevieve," she said. "You didn't just build a case. You laid the foundation for it before he even broke ground." The plan was set. They wouldn't fight the affair. They wouldn't fight about his cruelty or neglect. That was the battle he expected the one his lawyer Walter Finch was prepared for. They would ignore the emotional battlefield entirely and wage war on the intellectual one. They would let him think it was a simple, sordid divorce until the very last moment. When Conrad finally told her he was leaving her for Sloane, Genevieve feigned a believable, dignified heartbreak. She cried. She spoke of the years they had shared. She made him feel guilty but ultimately powerful, as if he were making a difficult but necessary choice. He left the meeting feeling magnanimous, convinced that the $250 million was more than enough to soothe her wounded pride. He had no idea he wasn't talking to his wife. He was talking to the CEO of the company that would soon bear her name, and she was simply accepting his resignation. The deposition took place in a sterile conference room at Walter Finch's law firm, a glass and steel monolith in Midtown Manhattan. The air was thick with tension. Conrad, flanked by Finch and a team of junior associates, looked every bit the master of the universe. He was there as a formality, a box to be checked before the final settlement was signed. Genevieve and Veronica Diaz sat opposite them. Diaz's team was smaller, just herself, and a paralegal. They were outgunned, outnumbered, and, in Finch's opinion, completely out of their league. Finch began with a clear strategy to paint Genevieve as a pampered socialite, completely detached from the brilliant, grueling work that had built Beaumont Global. He wanted to establish a narrative of the genius husband and the kept wife. "Mrs. Beaumont." Finch began his voice, a smooth, patronizing purr. "Could you describe your role in the early years of your husband's company?" "I was his partner," Genevieve said simply. Finch smirked. "A partner? In what sense did you attend board meetings? Did you negotiate financing deals? Did you have a title? An office?" "My role was more foundational," Genevieve replied, her composure unshakable. "Ah, foundational," Finch repeated, letting the word hang in the air as if it were absurd. "You mean emotional support, hosting dinner parties for investors. That is, of course, a valuable contribution to a marriage, but hardly a quantifiable stake in an $18 billion corporation." He went on like this for an hour, asking about her responsibilities for managing their homes, their social calendar, the education of their now adult children. He was building a picture for the record brick by condescending brick. Conrad watched a faint smile on his lips. This was going exactly as planned. Then it was Diaz's turn to question Conrad. She didn't begin with accusations or anger. She started softly, almost academically. "Mr. Beaumont, I'd like to talk about the Helios Project," she said. "It's often cited as the cornerstone of your empire. Can you recall for us the precise moment of its inception?" Conrad leaned back, happy to pontificate. "Of course, it was a bolt from the blue. I was at Columbia, working on my MBA. I realized the entire model of energy consumption was archaic. My idea was to decentralize the grid to create a closed-loop system where real estate was both the consumer and the producer. It was, if I may say so, revolutionary." "A closed-loop system," Diaz repeated, jotting down a note. "A fascinating term. And you conceived of this all on your own?" "Yes, entirely," he said, without a hint of hesitation. The lie was so old, so practiced, it had become his truth. "That's remarkable," Diaz said, her tone neutral. "Because the term closed-loop economic framework is the central tenet of a graduate thesis submitted to Columbia's Urban Planning Department in the spring of 1998. Are you familiar with it?" A flicker of annoyance crossed Conrad's face. "I'm not in the habit of reading academic papers. I'm too busy building the future to read about it." This one was titled The Helios Model, a closed-loop economic framework for sustainable urban growth. The author, Diaz paused, letting the silence stretch, was a Genevieve Sadler, your wife's maiden name. The air in the room changed. Walter Finch sat up straighter, his patronizing smile vanishing. "Coincidence, I'm sure," Conrad scoffed, but a bead of sweat traced a path down his temple. "Perhaps," Diaz conceded. "Let's move on. The initial pitch deck you used to secure funding from Vanguard Capital in 1999. Do you recall who created the financial projections in that document?" "I did. With my team," Conrad snapped. "Interesting. Because we had them analyzed by a forensic accounting firm. The modeling methodology, the specific algorithms used to project revenue, they are identical to the ones used in Chapter 4 of Ms. Sadler's thesis. Identical, Mr. Beaumont. Not similar. Copied." Finch slammed his hand on the table. "This is a fishing expedition. What are you implying?" "I'm not implying anything," Diaz said, her voice turning from silk to steel. "I am stating for the record that the foundational intellectual property of Beaumont Global was authored by my client, and per Clause 17B of a prenuptial agreement that you, Mr. Finch, drafted, she is entitled to equity proportional to that contribution." Conrad erupted. "This is insane. She was a student. I built an empire from nothing." "Did you?" Diaz asked, her gaze locking onto his. "Or were you just the first person to read the blueprints?" The deposition was a disaster for Conrad. The transcript was damning. Finch's strategy was in tatters. The narrative of the kept wife had been obliterated, replaced by the far more compelling story of the stolen legacy. But they still believed it was a negotiating tactic, a desperate last-ditch effort to squeeze a larger settlement out of him. They still couldn't fathom the true scope of Genevieve's endgame. They offered to raise the settlement to $500 million then, $1 billion they believed they were negotiating a financial settlement. They failed to understand that for Genevieve this was never about the money. It was about a correction to the historical record and a correction to the balance sheet of her life. Diaz refused every offer without a counter. "We'll see you in court," was her only reply. Conrad was furious, but not yet truly scared. He had the best lawyers, the best PR team. He had power. What did she have? An old college paper and a sentimental clause in a dusty document. He was Conrad Beaumont. He did not lose. The week before the final court date, Walter Finch and his team were in full-blown crisis mode. They had hired experts to discredit Genevieve's thesis, to argue that it was a vague academic exercise, and that Conrad's genius was in its execution. Their argument was plausible. An idea is worthless without the ability to bring it to life. A blueprint is not a building. They were preparing to argue that Clause 17b was legally void for vagueness. It was during this time that Veronica Diaz filed a final motion with the court presenting her Exhibit A. It was a simple, unassuming item, a faded 9 by 12-inch manila envelope. Finch and Conrad examined the digital scan of the exhibit. The envelope was sealed with yellowing tape. It was addressed to Genevieve Sadler at her old apartment near Columbia. The return address was her own, but it was the postmark that made Walter Finch's blood run cold. It was a crisp, clear stamp from the United States Postal Service, dated April 2nd, 1998. "What is this?" Conrad asked, irritated. "Junk mail from the 90s. Finch's face was pale. He understood immediately. "It's a poor man's copyright." He whispered the legal term, catching in his throat. "It's an old technique. You mail your own work to yourself and leave it sealed. The federal postmark serves as an indisputable time-stamped record of the date the contents existed." The date was critical. April 2nd, 1998. It was 3 months before Conrad had even incorporated his first company. It was a full year before he and Genevieve were married and signed the prenup. It was concrete, irrefutable proof that her foundational seed concept existed in its complete form long before Beaumont Global was anything more than a name on a piece of paper. The sealed envelope didn't just contain her thesis. It contained the entire genesis of the Beaumont Empire. This was the smoking gun. This wasn't just a college paper anymore. It was a legally time-stamped piece of intellectual property. Genevieve hadn't just written a blueprint. She had notarized it with the full authority of the U.S. government. Her quiet act of self-preservation 2.5 decades earlier had just become the most powerful weapon in a multi-billion-dollar war. The atmosphere in Conrad's camp shifted from arrogant confidence to sheer panic. Their entire defense that Conrad's execution was the true value was now severely weakened. Diaz would argue that the execution was merely the following of a detailed instruction manual that Genevieve had authored. A frantic, last-minute settlement offer was made. This time, it was for $3 billion, a figure that would have been one of the largest divorce settlements in history. The offer was relayed to Diaz, who was with Genevieve in her temporary apartment overlooking Central Park. $3 billion, Genevieve, Diaz said, holding the phone. You would never have to think about money or Conrad Beaumont ever again. Genevieve looked out the window at the sprawling city below, at the skyline, dotted with buildings whose existence could be traced back to a document she wrote at her kitchen table. "He still doesn't get it," she said, a sad, knowing smile on her face. "He thinks this is a negotiation. He thinks he can put a price on my life's work, and I'll just take the check and disappear." She turned to her lawyer. "Veronica, what does Clause 17b say about proportional equity?" Diaz pulled out the prenup, its pages now worn and familiar. "It says equity should be assigned in proportion to the concept's contribution to the final enterprise's valuation." "And what would you say the proportion is?" Genevieve asked. Diaz allowed herself a small, triumphant smile. "A forensic analysis team from MIT, hired by us, has concluded that 100% of the initial and sustained profitability of the Helios Project, which accounts for the vast majority of Beaumont Global's assets, is directly traceable to the proprietary models outlined in your thesis." "So the contribution isn't 10% or 20%, Genevieve mused. "No," Diaz affirmed. "The contribution is everything. The foundation, the entire building rests on it." Genevieve took a deep breath. "Then we're not settling. We are going to court to enforce the contract as it was written. Tell Mr. Finch I will see his client tomorrow morning, and I will be taking my company back." For Conrad, this refusal was the final terrifying confirmation that he had fundamentally misunderstood the woman he had been married to for 25 years. He had mistaken her quietness for weakness, her support for subservience. He had thought he was divorcing a wife, but he was facing a hostile takeover from the company's original founder, and tomorrow she was coming to collect. The final day in court was a spectacle. The media, catching wind of the dramatic turn, packed the gallery. Sloane Parker was outside, a lone vigilante of hope, her confident facade now showing visible cracks as rumors swirled. She had been texting Conrad all morning, but he hadn't responded. Inside, the atmosphere was glacial. Conrad Beaumont looked haggard. The air of invincibility had been stripped away, leaving behind a man who seemed smaller, older. Walter Finch's arguments were desperate, technical, and ultimately hollow. He argued about legal precedent, about the spirit of the law, but he couldn't escape the damning simple clarity of the evidence. Veronica Diaz, in her final statement, was masterful. She didn't raise her voice. She simply connected the dots with devastating precision. "Your Honor," she began, "for 25 years the world has been told a story. The story of a lone male genius, a visionary who created an empire from a bolt from the blue. It's a powerful story. It's also a complete fiction." She gestured towards the sealed, postmarked envelope, now officially entered into evidence and resting on the clerk's desk. "The truth is in that envelope. The truth is that Beaumont Global was not born in a boardroom, but in a university library, from the mind of a brilliant young woman named Genevieve Sadler." She walked the court through the evidence, the verbatim text from the thesis appearing in early business plans, the financial models copied and pasted, the emails from a young Conrad to Genevieve in 1998 asking her to flesh out that solar grid idea for him. "This case," Diaz continued, "is not about punishing infidelity. It is not about marital support. It is about a contract that Mr. Beaumont and his counsel drafted, a contract with a clause 17B, specifically designed to account for this exact scenario. The clause is not ambiguous. It calls for proportional equity, and the evidence shows that the proportion of Genevieve Beaumont's contribution is not a sliver, not a fraction. It is the whole. It is the alpha and the omega of this entire enterprise." She concluded, "Conrad Beaumont was not the architect of Beaumont Global. He was its first employee, and my client, the true founder, is here today to claim her rightful ownership." When she sat down, the courtroom was silent. Judge Morrison looked over the evidence one last time. She adjusted her glasses and looked directly at Conrad. "Mr. Beaumont," she said, her voice sharp and clear, "you have built a considerable empire. The execution and scaling of an idea are not insignificant. However, this court is not here to judge business acumen, but to interpret a legally binding contract." She picked up the prenup. "This document, which you yourself commissioned, contains a clause of extraordinary foresight. Clause 17B is clear. It protects the intellectual capital of the partners. The evidence presented by Ms. Diaz is overwhelming and irrefutable. The foundational seed concept for Beaumont Global was, without question, the intellectual property of Genevieve Beaumont." The judge paused, her words hanging in the air. "The question then is one of proportion. The court-appointed financial forensics experts have concurred with Ms. Diaz's assessment. The core business from which all other ventures grew is the Helios Project. Without it, Beaumont Global would not exist in its current form. Therefore, the originating intellectual property cannot be considered a minor contribution. It is the cornerstone. She looked from Conrad to Genevieve. This court has therefore calculated the value of the non-Helios-derived assets, acquisitions, and ventures developed independently in later years. These amount to approximately 30% of the total valuation of Beaumont Global. These will remain in the possession of Mr. Beaumont. Walter Finch visibly relaxed for a split second, thinking he had salvaged something significant. But the judge wasn't finished. The remaining 70%, she declared, her voice ringing with finality, which includes the entirety of the Helios Energy Project, its patents, its infrastructure, and a controlling interest in the parent company. Beaumont Global is deemed to be the direct result of the foundational seed concept provided by Genevieve Beaumont. As per the contract, you both signed this court awards that 70% in assets and equity to her. A collective gasp went through the gallery. It wasn't just a divorce settlement. It was a corporate decapitation. Conrad Beaumont didn't just lose his wife. He had just lost control of his own company. He slumped in his chair as if struck by a physical blow, his face a mask of disbelief. The judge banged her gavel. "This court is adjourned." Genevieve Beaumont stood up. She smoothed down her dress, her expression calm, serene. She hadn't smiled. She hadn't looked triumphant. She simply looked like a woman whose accounts had finally been balanced. She shook Veronica Diaz's hand, nodded respectfully to the judge, and turned to walk out of the courtroom and into her new empire. The heavy wooden doors of Courtroom 42 opened, and the blinding flash of cameras exploded. The media scrum surged forward, a wave of shouting reporters, but they parted almost instinctively as Genevieve Beaumont emerged. She walked with a quiet confidence that needed no announcement. Her lawyer, Veronica Diaz, was by her side. Down the marble steps by the waiting escalade, Sloane Parker watched the scene unfold. She saw the swarm around Genevieve, not Conrad. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She pulled out her phone, her thumb scrolling frantically through news alerts. And then she saw the headline from the Wall Street Journal's live court feed, "Beaumont Divorce. Stunner wife awarded 70% of empire takes control of Beaumont Global." The phone slipped from her fingers and clattered onto the pavement. 70%. Controlling interest. The words didn't compute. Her entire future, the life she had so carefully curated, the title of the next Mrs. Beaumont, it had all been a fantasy, predicated on a fortune that no longer belonged to the man she was waiting for. As Genevieve descended the steps, her path took her directly past Sloane. For a brief, charged moment, their eyes met. In Genevieve's gaze, there was no anger, no pity, no triumph. There was only a calm, dismissive finality, the look one gives a piece of furniture that is no longer part of the decor. She didn't slow her pace. She simply walked past, leaving Sloane standing alone on the sidewalk, a relic of a fallen king's reign. The escalade that was supposed to whisk Sloane and Conrad away to their new life now looked like a hearse. A reporter shoved a microphone in Sloane's face. "Sloane, what's your reaction? Did you know he didn't own his own company?" She was speechless. The man she had bet her entire life on was no longer a billionaire titan. He was a minority shareholder in his ex-wife's company. Inside the courthouse, Conrad Beaumont remained seated, a hollowed-out man, amidst the wreckage of his life. Walter Finch was attempting to speak to him about appeals, about motions, but the words were meaningless noise. Conrad stared at the empty chair where Genevieve had sat. He had underestimated her at every turn. He saw her as a beautiful memory, a comfortable habit, an obstacle to be managed. He never in his wildest nightmares saw her for what she was, his creator, and his undoing. Genevieve did not flee the city or hide in her newfound fortune. The next morning, she arrived at the Beaumont Global headquarters in a town car, not as a visitor, but as the majority owner. She called an emergency board meeting. The same men who had once patted her on the arm at cocktail parties now sat in stunned silence as she laid out her new vision for the company. There was no vitriol, only breathtaking competence. She spoke of expanding the Helios model, of pushing into new markets, of correcting the company's ethical drift. Her first official act was to announce the creation of the Genevieve Sadler Beaumont Foundation for Women in STEM and Entrepreneurship, funded with an initial endowment of $5 billion. Its mission, to ensure that no woman with a world-changing idea would ever have to watch a man take the credit for it. The story of Genevieve Beaumont became a modern legend. Not a story of revenge, but of reclamation. She didn't just divorce her husband, she corrected a historical injustice. She proved that the quietest person in the room is often the most powerful, and that a legacy buried under years of lies can one day be unearthed, reclaimed, and shine brighter than ever before. She didn't need his name, his money, or his kingdom. She had simply come back to take the throne she had built herself 25 years ago. A month after the verdict, the name on the towering skyscraper at Columbus Circle had not yet changed, but everything inside it had. The corner office on the 70th floor, once Conrad Beaumont's throne room, was now Genevieve's command center. The heavy masculine mahogany desk had been replaced with a sleek, minimalist table of reclaimed wood and steel. The ostentatious sculpture of a charging bull was gone, replaced by a serene landscape painting by a female artist she admired. The office, like its new occupant, was quieter, more focused, and infinitely more formidable. Genevieve had moved with the swift, decisive grace of a master strategist, finally allowed onto the battlefield. She didn't purge the company, she recalibrated it. Projects were streamlined, a new ethics committee was established, and the entire executive floor, so used to Conrad's blustering commands, was now adapting to Genevieve's calm, incisive questions. She wasn't just the owner, she was the chief architect, and she was redesigning her creation from the inside out. The world watched fascinated. Forbes ran a cover story titled "The Architect," finally giving her the name she had always deserved. Her foundation had already begun vetting its first round of grant applications, inundated with proposals from brilliant women who, like her, had been waiting in the wings. Meanwhile, the ghosts of the old regime were fading. Sloane Parker had vanished from the society pages. A junior reporter for a gossip blog spotted her once having a tense lunch in a mid-range bistro with a corporate headhunter. The Bottega Veneta suit was gone, replaced by a simple blazer. The aura of a future queen had been replaced by the quiet desperation of a disgraced executive looking for a job. She was a footnote, a cautionary tale whispered at cocktail parties about the dangers of betting on the wrong horse. Conrad, however, was not a ghost who would fade quietly. He still possessed a fortune that could buy small countries. His 30% stake was worth over $5 billion, but for a man like Conrad, money was just a way of keeping score. The real prize had always been power legacy and the myth of his own genius. Genevieve hadn't just taken his company, she had taken his story. One crisp afternoon, her executive assistant buzzed. "Ma'am, a Mr. Conrad Beaumont is in the lobby. He doesn't have an appointment, but he's insisting on seeing you." Genevieve looked out at the panoramic view of Central Park, the autumn leaves a blaze of gold and red. "Send him up," she said, her voice even. When Conrad walked into the office, he stopped just inside the door, momentarily disoriented. It was his space, yet it was alien to him. He looked thinner the custom-tailored suit hanging slightly loose on his frame. His tan couldn't hide the dark circles under his eyes. "You've redecorated," he said, the word sounding hollow. "I've reclaimed it," Genevieve corrected him softly, not rising from her chair. She gestured to the seat opposite her. "What can I do for you, Conrad?" The use of his name, so formal and detached, stung him. He sat looking for a sign of the woman he had known for 25 years, the supportive wife, the forgiving partner. He found none. He was looking at the chairperson of the board. "I wanted to talk," he began, trying to find his footing. "About us. About the past." "The past was adjudicated in a court of law," she replied, her hands folded calmly on the desk. "We are bound by its decision." "This isn't about the court, Jen." He snapped, a flash of the old arrogance returning. "This is about our life. You didn't just divorce me. You erased me. You took my life's work." Genevieve's gaze was unwavering. "There seems to be a fundamental misunderstanding even now," she said, her voice patient, as if explaining a complex formula to a slow student. "It was never your life's work. You were merely its public face. The work, Conrad, was mine. You have been handsomely compensated for your role as its long-term CEO, but that role has come to an end." He stared at her flabbergasted. The sheer, unshakable certainty of her statement left him no room to argue. He tried a different tactic, the one that had always worked before. He softened his voice, leaning forward with a pained expression. "Jen, think about what you're doing. To our history, to our name. Don't you remember the early days, the dreams we had in that tiny apartment?" "I remember them perfectly," she said, and for the first time, a flicker of emotion crossed her face. Not nostalgia, but a distant, clinical sadness. "I remember a young woman with a vision for the future, and I remember the man she loved who took that vision and told the world it was his own. I honored my half of our partnership for 25 years, Conrad. I supported you, I enabled you, and I stayed silent. You were the one who broke the contract. Not just with Sloane, but when you started to believe your own lie. Now I am simply enforcing the terms of our original agreement." He finally broke. "So this is it. You throw me out of my own company, my own life. And that's it. After everything?" Genevieve stood up the movement, signaling the end of the meeting. She walked to the window, her back to him. "This is not the end of your life, Conrad. It is simply the end of your life with me and your time at the head of my company," she said, looking down at the city she now helped to shape. "You have billions of dollars. You are free to build something new, something of your own this time. I would be genuinely interested to see what that looks like." It was the most devastating dismissal she could have delivered. It wasn't spoken with hatred, but with a complete and utter indifference. He was no longer her problem, no longer her partner, no longer even her rival. He was just someone else. Without another word, Conrad stood up and walked out of the office. He had built his footsteps silent on the new rug. Genevieve remained at the window for a long time. She was not celebrating. This final painful severance was the true cost of her victory. She had not just won a company. She had been forced to excavate her own life to separate the truth from the lies, the love from the transaction. She picked up a framed document from her desk. It was a preliminary grant approval from her foundation, funding a brilliant young physicist's revolutionary solar panel technology. It was the first of thousands. She was no longer just correcting the past. She was building the future, her future. And for the first time in a long time, the view from the top felt like her own. In the end, this wasn't just a divorce. It was a reckoning. Conrad Beaumont lost more than his money. He lost his own myth. He was exposed as the frontman for a genius he tried to erase. And Sloane Parker, who waited for a king, was left with nothing when she discovered he was merely a regent ruling on a queen's authority. The story of Genevieve Beaumont is a chilling and powerful reminder that the most dangerous person to underestimate is the one whose contributions you've taken for granted. She played the long game, armed with intelligence, patience, and a single unopened letter that held the keys to an empire. It makes you wonder how many other stories, how many other fortunes are built on the silent, uncredited work of a forgotten partner. What did you think of Genevieve's incredible strategy? Was it justice or the coldest revenge imaginable? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. If you found this story as compelling as we did, please hit that like button, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and make sure you subscribe to our channel for more true-life dramas you won't find anywhere else. Thanks for listening.